advising ministers in public and in private. Looking at all the data you can see, do you think we're going to open up on the 21st of June?
I think it's uncertain at the moment, and the paper we're putting out today is saying we should really distinguish between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. So both here at home, if we do have to adjust some of the freedoms because of the rising pressure from new variants, then it's important at least to ensure that those people who are vaccinated have the maximum freedom they can. And I think that could also be done for travel as well.
Is it acceptable to turn down a vaccine, do you think?
Unless you've got a good medical reason, my view very clearly is no. And I think that's why it's important to give people a real incentive to get vaccinated. Because, you know, if you are vaccinated, the evidence is absolutely clear. It reduces the risk of transmission and it reduces the risk of hospitalization or death.
So would you make them mandatory?
I don't think you can make them mandatory, but I think, and this is what we're suggesting today, by making it clear that, for example, if you are vaccinated, if you're double vaccinated, it should be much easier to come in and out of the country. And indeed, round the world, I think you will find that countries start to distinguish between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. So in Europe, for example, they're going to allow you to travel freely within Europe if you're double vaccinated.
The trouble is, this does create, does it not, a two-tier society between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. Looking at your own paper says that if you haven't been vaccinated, you won't be able to go to nightclubs and theatres and big sporting events and many other places. So you will be discriminated against.
Yeah, but I think, you know, the word discrimination's got a very loaded meaning in the English language now. But really, when it comes to risk management, it's all about discrimination. So the reason we vaccinate elderly people first is they're more at risk. The reason why we ensure that people are vaccinated is because it then reduces the risk of transmission, not merely of you getting ill yourself, but of you passing on the disease. So I think since everybody's going to be able to get the vaccination, other than those, as I say, who for medical reasons can't, then I think it really is important that people get encouraged to get vaccinated. And we also make suggestions as to how we can make sure you get proper proof of vaccination. I mean, actually, the NHS ex-people have done a good job in the NHS app, but we need to make that interoperable with other systems so that you can use this as proof of vaccination throughout the world.
I use the word discrimination advisedly because we know that people from ethnic minorities are less likely to be vaccinated. So figures saying among the over 50s, there is on average 25% less vaccine take-up among black people than white people. Now, that is discrimination if you're going to push them into a second
the
tier.
answer to that, Andrew, is to encourage people from that community to get vaccinated. And one other thing I think is very important, particularly in the context of the call to vaccinate the world by the end of 2022.
But might this not have exactly the opposite effect? I mean, there's a very interesting Sage paper about the hostility to government generally and the suspicion of government generally in these groups. It says, and I'm quoting, that because of historical issues and contemporary perceptions of institutional racism, it's much harder to persuade these groups to take the vaccine. And telling them they have to, or they're going to be kept out of sporting events and many other places, is simply going to make them feel angrier, not less.
I'm not sure about that. I really think if you explain the facts to people, they can see the value of getting vaccinated. Now, one other thing I've asked for over these last weeks, and I still think we should do this, is that we are in a, I'm going to say unique, I think virtually unique position as a country of vaccinating at scale using both the messenger RNA vaccine, that's Pfizer, and an adenovirus vaccine, more traditional type of vaccine, AstraZeneca. I think rather than putting the data out in percentage risk reduction, if we were to publish the overall figures showing the numbers vaccinated with each, the numbers of those that still got COVID, the numbers of those hospitalized, the numbers of those died, as, for example, they do in Israel, I think the impact would be dramatic, not just here in Britain, but round the world. Because one of the biggest problems, by the way, in getting the world vaccinated is there's now a resistance to the AstraZeneca vaccine that I think is completely unjustified on the data. And if we did publish the data in that way, I think you would see very clearly both, one, that vaccines are massively effective in reducing the disease, and two, that AstraZeneca and Pfizer are roughly similar.
So that's a public communication thing, really. Can I just bring you back to the plan for vaccine passports? or passes. This needs buy-in from the industry, in particular the hospitality industry. And the truth is they don't like the idea. Kate Nichols, who's CEO of Hospitality UK, says that vaccine passports would be unworkable and cause conflict between the staff and customers. She surely knows her industry better than you do.
Yeah, but I think that you're not mandating this, you're facilitating it. So I think that there may well be situations in which people decide they don't want to make that distinction. But I think you're going to find in many settings, people do want to know if they're going into that setting that the people around them, if they're mixing in close quarters, have been vaccinated. And I think, when you look around the world at some of the best practice on this, it's very, very clear that in the end, it's not just going to be something that government does. The consumer, the citizen, has also got a voice in this.
One last group that really concerns me, I'd like to hear your views on, are disabled people with autoimmune problems in particular, who can't be vaccinated. Surely this is grossly unfair to them. They have a hard enough time already.
Right, so you've got to make special provision, because obviously that would be completely inappropriate to discriminate against them. It's a relatively small group of people, but you need special provision for those. I'm 100% sympathetic to that. What I'm not sympathetic to are people who are able to get the vaccine and just refuse to get it.
This whole argument reminds me of something going back for some years. This is ID cards by the back door, isn't it?
Look, I was then, I remain even more convinced today, particularly with biometric technology. The world will move to biometric ID, and they'll do it because in the end it's better for people. It's not about, look, the amount of information government's going to have on you is going to be minimal compared with what your local supermarket has on you. So this is a completely sensible way to go, and I think you will find right round the world that people move in this direction because it will facilitate the access to government services. And by the way, in some of the developing countries, it will cut out fraud.
You're very plugged in. Are ministers interested in this, do you think?
I mean, I don't know, but I hope so, because it's just an obvious change. And the thing is about biometric ID, I mean, as you know, my view is the whole world's getting changed by technology. The big political debate we should be having, we're not really having it, is how do you master this technology and harness it for the public good? But in every single field of our work, our leisure, the way we interact with each other, technology is going to change everything. So, biometric ID is just one part of a much, much bigger picture.
Do you think, again, it's in some respects an ethical or moral dilemma, do you think we should be vaccinating children to protect the entire society?
Yes, I think you're definitely moving in that direction in the end. And I think, it's already been shown, I think, in studies that, 12 to 18-year-olds will get vaccinated.
And you've also said you want us to vaccinate the whole world, help vaccinate the whole world by the end of this year. So it's a question of priorities and choices. Which matters more? Vaccinating everybody in the UK first, or starting to send vaccinations around the world?
Look, it's important when you're outside of government not to advocate something you wouldn't do inside government.
Exactly.
So the priority will always be first to get your own country vaccinated, and we're doing that. What we're saying is you won't be able to vaccinate the whole world in 2021. You will be able to do it, as Boris Johnson's saying today, by the end of 2022. But what you could do by the end of this year is vaccinate the most vulnerable. And that means frontline healthcare workers, the elderly, and those around big urban conurbations. And the reason for doing that is enlightened self-interest. It's not humanitarian simply. It's because it helps us to stop the disease spreading.
So in your view, Boris Johnson should go to the G7 and say, we're going to vaccinate everybody in the UK first, but then we're going to send as much vaccines as possible around the world.
Yes, and I think that's what they will do. I mean, look, you can't be absolute about this. There may be some vaccine that we can ship out in advance of that, But no, the reality is countries, your government's obliged to look after your own people. But in order to get this vaccination of the world, by the way, and we set this out in a paper recently, a very good independent scientific experts report for the G7, just published a few days back. To do this properly, however, you're going to need to keep production going. You're going to need to make sure that countries have the capacity to absorb and to vaccinate, because many of them presently don't. And you're going to have to make sure you overcome the hesitancy about vaccines. You have been following the detail all the way through this pandemic very closely. Do you think it originated in a wet market or from a lab? Go on. I've literally no idea. So it could have come from a lab? Well, I think, look, I know I know no more than you know or anyone reading the newspapers. I mean, I think you just got to keep an open mind on it. But it's not something, I haven't really focused on that, to be absolutely frank, because I'm not an expert on that type of thing, and I just don't know. But what I do know is that if we're going to face this situation in the future, we're going to have to create a global infrastructure to deal with future pandemics, because I think what has happened to us is probably part of a change that is going to be just normal life for the foreseeable future.
Tony Blair, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks very much indeed for coming in. Now then, joining me from